Just because a PlayStation 5 plugs into a 4K TV and maybe the TV runs at 60 hertz does not mean the PlayStation 5 is rendering the game at 4K resolution and outputting 60 frames per second. And I got a lot of people who seem to misunderstand that in my comment section when I did a video talking about a PS5 Pro equivalent PC build and the idea of should you just build a gaming PC instead. In this video, I want to talk more about the actual performance characteristics of a PlayStation 5 and compared to a PC. And correct a lot of these misunderstandings. We also now have more information about how it looks like the PlayStation 5 Pro is running the games that have been revealed so far, which is really interesting. And then I'd also like to talk a little bit about should we really be comparing consoles and PCs? Because I don't think they're quite as direct competitors as people might think. Because yes, they both play video games, but in very, very different ways. So in this video, we'll talk about the performance characteristics of consoles and a lot about the differences between PC and console. Anyway, so let's get back to that idea I was saying first, which is, okay, just because you're plugging the PlayStation 5 into a 4K TV that runs at 60 hertz doesn't mean you're running at 4K 60. So what do I mean by that, and why do I think people misunderstand this? Well, I think because a PlayStation doesn't offer you a frame rate counter, and it doesn't really tell you what graphic settings you're running at, and doesn't tell you what rendering resolution you're using, then a lot of people might just assume, because it's especially because it's marketed as like a 4K console, that that's what it's doing, that it's playing games at 4K 60. However, it is possible to get frame rate calculations for console and resolution calculations for console. It just takes a lot more work than it does on PC. On PC, we're generally very aware of the frame rate and resolution and settings that we're using because you choose them. And if the game doesn't offer a frame rate counter, a lot of people would run one through their GPU software, a third-party app like MSI Afterburner. So on PC, we're usually just more aware of how our PC is running than maybe a console user is. Now, the best way to get those calculations for console is to capture the console's video feed on a capture card, and then you can actually count the number of frames that are being output per second. So you can get a frames per second readout. And also, if you look at still images of the game, in scenes that display the internal rendering resolution, the individual pixels, you can then look at how many pixels are showing on a certain area of the screen, and you could then extrapolate the overall rendering resolution of that scene. Now, I focus on PC stuff, so I don't have a lot of the tech to do that nicely. However, at Digital Foundry, they do that all the time. And you can pull up written versions of their articles for pretty much any game if you use Eurogamer articles. And so in this video, how about we start by looking at a little bit of Digital Foundry's analysis on how console games actually run. Now, I just picked a couple kind of random examples. Final Fantasy 16 just came out on PC today, so how about we look at how it runs on console? Also, that does bring up a good advantage to consoles, because again, if we're thinking more about the should you get games on console or PC, some games come out first on console, and you have to wait until later to get them on PC. It's nice that most PS5 exclusives are eventually coming to PC now, but we don't get them right away. And the same thing might end up being the case for like GTA 6. That could be a good reason to want to have a console if you want to play that when it comes out, and not have that missing out against your console friends who are all talking about the game and playing it, right? So Final Fantasy 16's been out on PlayStation 5 for a while. We're just getting it today on PC. But how does it actually run on consoles? Well, I pulled up the Eurogamer article, which uses the Digital Foundry analysis. They're affiliated, to pull up some information on this. So it's looking like Final Fantasy 16 on the PlayStation 5. Now, we're not talking about the PlayStation 5 Pro. We're talking about the PlayStation 5. On the PlayStation 5, Final Fantasy 16 has two modes, a quality mode and a performance mode. They both aggressively use dynamic resolution scaling and TAA to reduce shimmer and noise. Now, I want to talk about dynamic resolution scaling because this is another big difference between how games tend to run on consoles versus how they tend to run on PC. On PC, most games don't offer a dynamic resolution scaling setting, although some do. Some of the Nixies ports, especially of some of the PS5 games, for example, like Horizon Forbidden West offers it. There's other games as well. What dynamic resolution scaling does is the game has like set graphics settings and a set frame rate it's trying to achieve, generally either 30 or 60 if we were talking about console games. And then it allows the game to render at a lower resolution if it's a harder to run scene in order to stay locked to that frame rate target. But if the scene is easier to run, it can use that additional available GPU horsepower to render the game at a higher resolution. That's the rendering resolution changes on the fly. That's why it's called dynamic. It's changing. So in quality mode, it looks like this game, Final Fantasy XVI, is typically rendering between 1080p and 1440p resolution, and then it's upscaled to a 4K output on the TV. Now, how is it achieving the upscale? Well, a lot of console games use FSR 2. Some of them, if they're in Unreal Engine 5, use TSR from Unreal Engine 5. Some of them use some other temporal anti-aliasing-based upscaler. Some of them just straight up use a spatial upscaler like FSR 1. And actually, unfortunately, that's the case with Final Fantasy XVI, is it uses what appears to be an FSR 1, or at least FSR 1 style, spatial upscaler, which isn't really adding a lot of rendering detail. It just kind of blurs and smooths things out to try to fill up a 4K screen. But the actual amount of pixel detail is only a rendering resolution of 1080p to 1440p. Now, in the game's performance mode, it actually drops below 1080p resolution. Now, that's talking about the rendering resolution the game's running at, but what about its frame rate? Well, it looks like the quality mode is targeting 30 frames per second and is mostly hitting it. But the performance mode looks like it's targeting 60 FPS, but has regular dips below that, and oftentimes even below 48. And that would be significant because the PlayStation 5 only supports variable refresh rate up to 48 FPS and above, meaning if it goes below 48 frames per second, you will get screen tearing and issues like that. It doesn't have a low frame rate compensation mode like most PCs and PC monitors would be capable of. And a lot of people running a console don't even have a variable refresh rate display. A lot of TVs, especially older ones, don't have a variable refresh rate mode, in which case you wouldn't be able to take advantage of that at all. And that also explains why consoles are generally trying to target a locked 30 or a locked 60, because a lot of TVs are 60 hertz, and so that's how you would get a nice, smooth appearing image if you don't have variable refresh rate support. So that's the performance of a big game like Final Fantasy XVI on PlayStation 5 non-Pro. Now, there are games that run at significantly higher rendering resolutions. For example, I pulled up God of War Ragnarok because we'll be getting the PC version soon. Again, been out on PS5 for a long time, so big advantage for consoles. Got access to God of War Ragnarok a long time ago. PC users have been having to wait. Also, this game runs really well on console. I've already played it on my PS5. It runs pretty well. However, I didn't use the quality mode because the quality mode actually does, believe it or not, hold a native 4K resolution. But it only does it at 30 frames per second. And in an action game like this, I just don't think 30 FPS feels great, especially if there's another option available. But do some PS5 games run at a native 4K resolution? Yes. However, they often do it at 30 frames per second. That's the trade-off. Are there some that run at 4K 60? Yes, if they have extremely simple graphics. But the vast majority of PS5 games do not run at 4K 60. However, they also have a performance mode. The performance mode relies on dynamic resolution scaling between 1440p and up to a full native 4K, depending on the demands of the scene. Looks like often around 1872p, which is a very high rendering resolution and running at 60 FPS or even above, because this game does offer an unlocked mode, which I use since I do have a variable refresh rate 120 Hz 4K TV for my PS5. So this game performed really well. However, I will say that the upscale itself did leave a lot of shimmering that I likely wouldn't have seen if I was rendering the game like maybe using DLSS upscaling on a PC. Although this game is using a type of TAAU, which is apparently more advanced than the previous God of War used on consoles. So there's that. Anyway, so that's a game that's an example of one that is actually running at a pretty high rendering resolution on the PS5. Now that's probably because the game was designed around the PS4. It has a PS4 version, so it was designed around older hardware. Now, if we look at games that are really pushing graphics technology, we can see them start to dip into extremely low rendering resolutions. And also the other thing I should mention is oftentimes the PC version of the game will offer much higher maximum graphic settings. So we've talked about resolution and frame rate. What about graphic settings? So I decided to pull up another big, graphically demanding type game, and in this case, we're looking at Alan Wake 2. And once again, looking at a Eurogamer article talking about Digital Foundry analysis, where they've taken screenshots of the PlayStation 5 version, screenshots of the PC version at different graphic settings, and you can then match which setting is set to what on the console, since the console doesn't really tell you, but you can get those PC equivalent settings. So if we look at this, we can compare the PS5's performance mode in Alan Wake 2 and its quality mode with the PC's medium preset. And you can see that the quality mode, which is only targeting 30 frames per second, is generally running at mostly matching the medium settings on PC, with a couple of settings turned down a little bit. The texture settings turned down a little bit, and the post-processing effects turned down from high to low. So the PS5's max graphics mode doesn't even quite live up to the PC's medium graphics preset. And the PS5's performance mode, which is trying to target 60 frames per second, and I might add needs to go way below a 1080p internal rendering resolution in order to do that, is actually significantly below the PC's medium preset. It's more like the PC's low preset. So with that in mind, we can now conclude a bunch of things. The PlayStation 5, and so far we've been talking about the non-pro version, generally renders well below 4K resolution in big AAA games. It generally does it significantly below the PC's maximum graphics settings, and it usually does, targets either 30 or 60 frames per second. And oftentimes the 60 frames per second mode falls short of 60 frames per second. Now, let's talk a little bit about falling short of 60 frames per second a bit, because oftentimes that's related to the CPU performance in the console. Because when I, again, did my video about, trying to match the PlayStation 5 Pro hardware specs in PC format, I chose a Ryzen 5 3600, saying that it was roughly equivalent. Now, I wasn't saying you should build a PC with that CPU. I was saying that that CPU is roughly equivalent to the gaming performance in a PlayStation 5, and the PlayStation 5 Pro isn't really boosting the CPU performance. So that would also be similar. And I said that that could mean that the PlayStation 5 Pro is often not going to hit 60 FPS if the game was CPU limited rather than GPU limited. Anyway, I got a lot of pushback. This is the thing I got the most pushback against in the comment section. A lot of people pointed out that PS5 uses an 8-core processor, and I chose a 6-core processor. That's true, but the 8-core processor in the PS5 is a bit of an older architecture, and it's downclocked significantly. So the overall processing power, which is what matters for gaming, not really just how many cores and threads it has. There's no exact match on PC. But the overall gaming performance of this processor is about the same, and a lot of PC users will tell you that's not really a very good CPU if you're trying to chase high frame rate gaming. It can dip to low frame rates in a CPU bottleneck situation in a lot of modern games. And yeah, that's kind of my point. This is one of the biggest issues with the design of the PS5 and PS5 Pro. I'm not saying it's a mistake. They have budget constraints, but that's why oftentimes you fall below 60 frames per second. For example, there's even games that go below 30 frames per second due to a CPU limit. Now, that's usually a game that's kind of terribly programmed, but let me give evidence that I'm correct on this. Once again, I pulled up a Digital Foundry analysis, since they have the ability to pull up PS5 frame rates, since they have that capture ability and some tools to do that. A game like Gotham Knights was incredibly CPU bound when it launched on console and PC. And they indicated that when the game was targeting 30 frames per second and it dipped below it, that when a Ryzen 5 3600 PC with a high-end GPU, which is not GPU limited at this point, so indicating the bottleneck is the CPU, notice that they are both dipping to 27 frames per second under a CPU-limited situation on a Ryzen 5 3600, indicating the CPU performance in this game is roughly equivalent between the PS5 and the Ryzen 5 3600, and indicating that oftentimes the limit in the game on the PlayStation 5 is the CPU. Now, this is an extreme example. Most games can at least achieve 30 frames per second on a Ryzen 5 3600, but many of them struggle to achieve a locked 60 frames per second. And when that's the case, the PlayStation 5 Pro is also unlikely to go to 60 frames per second because if the CPU limits the performance, then you can use the GPU to increase the rendering resolution or increase the graphics settings, but you're not going to be increasing the frame rate if you're already bottlenecked by the CPU unless the developers further optimize the CPU performance in the game. So with all of that being said, let's talk more about the PlayStation 5 Pro. So as I mentioned in the video where I did the build, the Radeon RX 6700 is the closest performance equivalent we have to the GPU in the PS5 non-Pro, and that Sony has claimed a roughly 45% performance uplift, meaning a GPU like a RX 6800 is going to be roughly the power level for rasterized performance of the PS5 Pro. Notice that that puts it below the performance of an RTX 4070, very similar to a RX 7700 XT, very close to the performance of a 3070 Ti. But you can see that we're matching, mid-range to upper mid-range PC hardware when we're talking about the PS5 Pro equivalent GPU hardware. Now, I also mentioned in that video that the PS5 Pro has an AI upscaler that the AMD GPUs that are listed here don't have access to, meaning it might actually, from an upscaling perspective, maybe be more equivalent to an NVIDIA GPU, but not quite as powerful as a 4070. So something like a 3070 Ti, if the 3070 Ti had more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM, because the console has more VRAM, more RAM that can be used for VRAM. Anyway, so that kind of gave us that kind of rough ballpark there. Now, how will games actually run on the PS5 Pro? Well, I actually, since I was looking at Digital Foundry a bunch for my discussion points in this video, they actually have analyzed the footage that was released for the PS5 Pro announcement trailer and have actually pulled up some performance characteristics. So we could take a quick look at that. Where they're saying that Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart on PS5 Pro is running at a variable resolution of 1440p to 1800p to hit 60 frames per second. And now it's achieving like a 4K output using that internal rendering resolution using PSSR upscaling. So in other words, a lot of PlayStation 5 Pro games are probably still going to be rendering below 4K resolution, but they're going to use the new AI upscaler, PSSR, in order to try to achieve a better looking output and maybe have higher internal resolutions before the upscale takes place. So in other words, will the PS5 Pro be a native 4K console? And the answer is in many games, well, it depends on what the developers choose to do, but in many games, they'll probably rely on the new AI upscaler and still choose to render the games below 4K native resolution. Now, there's a problem with that, but let's just be real about what we're expecting it to do. They're showing that Alan Wake 2 in the footage that was released, which was not very much when they pixel counted it, it was running at 864p in its 60 FPS mode and using PSSR to upscale. Or they had some footage that appeared to be 30 frames per second, and that seemed to be running at 1260p and also seemed to be showing some ray traced reflections. So if you use the increased ray tracing hardware in the PS5 Pro, you'll also probably be taking a hit to rendering resolution and frame rate, because even if it's better than what was in the PS5, that doesn't mean that it doesn't take additional cost, right? They saw Horizon Forbidden West seem to just be increasing the visual settings to be more matching what a PC could do. Hogwarts Legacy appeared to still be running at 30 FPS, but with higher quality ray tracing. Gran Turismo 7 appeared to be adding ray tracing and using PSSR upscaling to hit a 4K output, but only with an 1188p internal rendering resolution, whereas the base PS5 runs the game at a, actually, this is one of the games that actually does run at a native 4K 60 on the base PS5, but does it without ray tracing. And they saw Assassin's Creed Shadows running at 864p, so again, below 1080p resolution, but using PSSR upscaling to try to hit 60 FPS in a 4K output result from an internal render at 864. Now, that doesn't mean that any of this means the PS5 Pro is somehow bad or anything. That's not what I'm trying to say. I'm just saying that while the base PS5 wasn't really a 4K 60 console in most games, neither is the PS5 Pro. A lot of times what they're going to do is they're going to choose to use upscaling because that's one of the whole points of the PS5 Pro, is having the AI upscaler. And having the AI upscaler allows you to then maybe do things like add in more RT settings or increase the other visual settings compared to the base PS5 version. But we'll have to see. It'll be up to the developers what they want to do with that. But if they have a game that can't hit 60 FPS due to the CPU, they're probably going to have to stay in a 30 FPS mode and maybe up the graphics settings, right? So that's just giving us a realistic idea of what the console is going to be capable of. It also means that trying to chase like 120 hertz modes and things like that will likely still be held back by the fairly weak CPU inside the system. So I want to kind of end this video with a little more of a talk about, let's get back to that idea of, so should you build a gaming PC instead of get a PS5 Pro? Because, well, that was the title, or at least part of the title of my previous video that I'm in some sense kind of adding on to here. In that video, I just focused on the hardware. I didn't so much try to address that question directly from like how an end user actually uses it. So here's my actual thought on that. Somebody who just wants a convenient experience where you just plug in a box to your TV, you turn it on, and your game is just right where you left it off because it had quick resume, and it's just super simple and easy to use in a living room format, then I think a console is actually a better way to go than even a significantly more powerful PC. Because in general, PCs will have more inconvenience in a home theater type setup. Games don't just quite nicely just instantly stand by at the push of a button and resume 3 days later, right back where you left off, quite the way that they do just nicely on console. Also, I use my console as a Blu-ray player. I know a lot of people stream everything nowadays, but honestly, streaming looks like garbage compared to physical discs, but that's a whole other topic. Anyway, I'm not saying I buy everything on a physical disc, but certain things I like to still have physical discs for. And while the PS5 Pro doesn't come with a disc player, I guess you could buy one to go along with it. But anyway, so there's, again, other reasons why the PS5 might make sense as a media player. Also, excuse me, for streaming stuff, a lot of the like streaming apps on PC are much worse than they are on a PlayStation console or even the native apps on a TV. Like a lot of times like Netflix and things like that, last time I checked, it only streams at 1080p on PC. It doesn't even give you a 4K stream. Like there's a lot of reasons why a console is just more convenient in a living room setup. Whereas, so what is the advantage of PC? So on PC, you're not relying on the developers choosing what they want to do with the performance, right? Here we're relying on the developers choosing, do they want to increase the rendering resolution? Do they want to increase the frame rate? Do they want to increase the graphic settings? That's all your choice. You get to choose the graphic settings, right? When we looked at those Alan Wake 2 graphic settings, the console offered two modes, performance mode and quality mode, whereas the PC offered all of these individual settings, and every single one can be adjusted manually, including the rendering resolution and what upscaling technique you're using. And you get to decide if you want your monitor to be 4K or 1440p or 1080p, and how many hertz it's going to be. PC offers a vast array of choice, but that also makes it a lot more fiddly, and some people enjoy that, and some people hate that. And if you hate that, you probably don't want to go the PC route. But if you like all of that customization and control, I mean, playing in that theme, the modding support on PC, there's so much more there, and plus just PCs can do a lot of things consoles can't do. They can be used for work, for school, for creative applications. They can be used for so much more than just playing video games. So the consoles have their advantages. PC has its advantages. And what I'm trying to get at here is if you have the Venn diagram on like people who perfectly match PC gaming and people who perfectly match, console gaming, there's overlap there. So there is, I think, some people where it's competition. But for a lot of people, there's just things that aren't in that overlap that you're just really drawn to, where you need to buy one or the other. Or you'll buy one of each, right? Like I still have a PS5, even though I also have a high-end gaming PC and I also have a Nintendo Switch. So like there's reasons to have them. And we can get into all the exclusive games and everything like that. But and then there's the cost. Like when I did my last video, I was mostly focusing on the cost of the parts. And even then I concluded that a PlayStation 5, a Pro equivalent PC, if you buy every part new, generally will cost more than $700, especially if you're not shortchanging yourself and not quite actually matching the PS5 Pro. Although the PS5 Pro certainly does seem to offer less value, maybe relatively to the base model version from a performance per dollar format. So I wonder if Sony's taking less of like a subsidized cost approach on the Pro model than the base model. Anyway, so this video kind of had a lot of topics. Hopefully you guys found it useful and or interesting. Again, I was trying to clarify the performance level that consoles actually have for both the PS5 and the PS5 Pro. Because again, not usually 4K 60, and that's still going to be the case on the PS5 Pro. Also, I was trying to clarify the differences between PlayStation and, or just generally console gaming and PC gaming, and that they're really not necessarily direct competitors as far as what type of person is going to be drawn to each one, right? So there's definitely pros and cons to both. So should you just build a gaming PC instead of a PS5 Pro? Well, if you're drawn towards customization, you can choose whether you want to go to a higher frame rate. You can choose whether you want a better CPU than a Ryzen 5 3600. If you want to make all of those choices and you're excited about that, great. Maybe you should go the PC route. If you just want a really simple way to play a game on your TV, you just push a button and it turns on and it works and it's not crazy expensive, then maybe just stick with the console route. There's nothing wrong with that. There's also nothing wrong with doing both. So hopefully you guys enjoyed the video, and I hope all of you have an excellent day.